If you ask almost any personal trainer out there, what's the most important part of doing an exercise? Almost across the board, they're going to say something along the lines of making sure you're doing it correctly or using the right form. And while this can make the person asking the question feel taken care of and like they're going to be safe and very appreciative of the answer, in our opinion, form doesn't matter at all. And on today's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, we want to tell you why. We're going to cue the intro song and then we're going to dive right into this conversation. Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg. Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Charlie. Before we dive into this week's episode, I want to let you know that we recently released a book called The Exercise for Life Method. And if you enjoy the conversations that we have every single week on this podcast, then you are going to love this book. So to pick up a free copy of this book, all you have to do is go to exerciseforlifemethod.com. Now, without further ado, let's dive into this week's episode. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we're coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg, here in Schaumburg, Illinois, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise that's geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. Now, we have put out a ton of episodes of the Exercise is Health podcast. In fact, this is episode number 208, and all along the way, we've had some really nice people say some really nice things about us. And so we want to kick off today's episode actually reading one of the reviews that we received on Apple Podcasts.
So this review is entitled Flexibility, and it says, I just listened to a podcast on flexibility and appreciate that Julie and Charlie Cates question historical and novel stretching techniques. The advice offered is very wise and will definitely help some of my quote-unquote inflexible figure skating students think differently about their muscles and might even allow them to move their joints with greater efficiency and safety. Thank you so much for that 5-star review. And if you are interested in more flexibility content, just like this review was implying, please go back to our previous episodes to check them out.
And if you feel so inclined as to leave us a nice message, we always appreciate that. You can rate us and review us right on Apple Podcasts. I don't know if you can rate and review on other platforms, but I know you can rate and review on Apple Podcasts. So please head over there, leave us a rating and review. And we always love hearing feedback from everybody who's listening to our podcasts about what content they want to learn more about. And we always love hearing your thoughts on the Exercise is Health podcast. Now, today we are talking about something that within the mainstream fitness industry is kind of held in high regard. And if you talk to most personal trainers out there and ask them, hey, what is the most important part of doing any exercise? Almost across the board, they're going to tell you the form, how you do the exercise. You need to make sure that you're doing the exercise correctly. And while there are good intentions behind this response, in our opinion, form does not matter at all. And today, that's exactly what we're going to discuss, is why we don't care about form.
You know, form is one of those, what is that word I'm trying to think of? Like a
soundbite?
Yeah, like a soundbite or like a catchy word, like, oh, if you have the right form, it's like something you get to flaunt, right? And it is important, the concept that it's trying to share. But the way that it's often accepted by the user, the exerciser, which is what really matters, it's like, how do we apply these principles of exercise to your body? That's where it starts getting kind of mixed up. And we want to spend some time explaining what we mean by this, because we're not saying don't think about form and so just do whatever you want and move however you want and that's the right way to do it. But the idea that when we say form and what you think or what you do when you think form is not what we want you to think of when you think of form. So I actually used to teach personal training classes at the local community college here. I would help people become certified to become a personal trainer. And there was a huge section in the book that was form. And if you can imagine, if you are listening to this, so I know you're an exerciser, you've probably been exposed to some of these common form thingies. And some of the things you've heard of, it's probably like when you think of doing a squat, you think, oh, stick your butt out, get the weight in your heels, don't let your knees go over your toes. Or if you're doing a push-up, make sure you get your chest to the ground. Or maybe sometimes people say, oh, put a block there. Make sure your chest gets to the block. Make sure your hands are in this certain position. All those types of things are what we're talking about when we're thinking form. They're like the basic bullet list that goes to accompany any exercise.
Yeah, the internet really, in my opinion, is kind of the worst place for this, because if you watch any exercise video, there are always trolls on there that are heckling about form. And their intentions may be good. I think they're just, posting spam, but for the most part, they're trying to say, well, they're not doing the exercise to the gold standard way. And in their head, they relate the gold standard way to both safety and effectiveness. So they'll watch somebody do an exercise on a screen and they'll say, well, that's not the gold standard way. Look at how their knees are moving. Look at how their hips are moving. Oh, right there. Yeah, that wasn't good. They're not doing the exercise correctly. And they may be coming with the very best intentions of saying, well, because they're not doing it the gold standard way, they're at a higher risk for injury. Or because they're doing the exercise not in the gold standard way, they are not going to get the results that they're wanting as efficiently as they could. The exercise isn't going to be as effective as it could. So that's kind of one branch of form. The other branch of form is when people will post themselves doing an exercise. Like I just saw an Instagram post yesterday. Hey, look, I finally was able to do, like a high bar squat with, narrow stance and, look at my depth and everything like that. And now here's the thing, like if your goal from working out is to be able to choreograph a certain move, okay, awesome. But most of us are not doing an exercise or not exercising in general to become highly proficient at doing the gold standard form of a squat. Like we are trying to improve our health, improve our function. And so those two branches of form, one, critiquing others, and then two, kind of glorifying your own, it really misleads people on what's actually important when it comes to doing an exercise and why, in our opinion, your form really doesn't matter.
Charlie, you said something in there that I want to rephrase because I thought it was such a good concept, but I want to talk about it for a little bit. You said the gold standard is like, how you should be doing the exercise. And what we're saying is that we want you to get a certain outcome from the exercise. Two very different things. I want to tell you a little quick story, and then I'm going to wrap it back to what we're talking about. So Charlie and I, 5 years ago, we bought a house.
Mm-hmm. 5 years ago this spring.
So almost 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we bought a house, and the house was a beautiful house, but we had to rip everything out. Like we had to pull out all the floors. It was gross. Like, it was
structurally, it was good.
It was amazing. Yeah, it was amazing, but it was just like the house was built the same year I was born, and nothing had been changed, right? So we had like 30-year-old carpet in there. Anyways, we ripped everything out, and my dad, he actually used to build homes in high school, and then his brother, my uncle, has a whole construction company. So he was like, okay, I'm going to come, we're going to update these things. I'm going to help you guys out. Great. So we rip out the laminate flooring near our front door, and we find that there's a part of the floor next to the door that was rotten. And it was rotten, and I was like, oh, wow, like that looks like there's a hole in the floor. And my dad was like, yeah, it looks like there's a hole. We need to fix it. And so we went to Home Depot, and he said, okay, this is how we fix these holes. So we got some stuff to fix the hole. Then we got home, and he looked at it, and he said, this is how I've always fixed holes in the past, but now that I am looking at this hole, it actually looks like the cause is from your door is leaking. It's not actually the floor has a problem, but it's coming from the door. And so we need to actually go back to Home Depot, and we're not going to do it the way that these holes are normally fixed. We're going to do it this other technique because I know that due to the cause and what I'm seeing now that we've studied it a little longer, that we're going to need some different stuff because of the situation, because of what was present, because of the damage that was there, because of the cause of the damage that was there. And so I said, okay, cool. Sounds good. Let's do that. Because really what we were looking for was the outcome, right? We needed the hole to be fixed and we needed the cause to be fixed, right? So we had to fix the door, which was like a negative step. It was like a step before fixing the floor. So we fixed the door, we fixed the floor, and we didn't really do it the way that he first thought, which was the gold standard of how you fix these floor holes, apparently. I don't know how to do it, but he was telling me. That's kind of like exercise. It's like when we start to exercise, the gold standard of the form that everyone does, or the form that you think should apply to every squat, every push-up, every pull-down, every lunge, we could start there. Like, that's some good ideas of like maybe what we should start with. But as you explore exercisers, your body, and you're doing these exercises and feeling how your body's feeling, or you're working with a trainer that kind of thinks like Charlie or I, we should start seeing your exercises go very far away from the gold standard. Reason being is because we're going to find, where are your muscles not functioning well? Where are your bones and joints? Where are they not feeling good? Where do you have the start of arthritis? Where do you have a limit, or where do you struggle with coordination? All of those things are kind of like filling this hole in my house. It needed to be filled. We need to get the job done, but it was about the outcome. It wasn't about how we did it. And that is just like the exercise, is that we can start with an idea, but we have to start customizing once we start learning about the user, the exerciser. Once we start learning about you, the exerciser, or once you start learning about you, the exerciser, through experience, you got to start going away from that gold standard, not because the gold standard isn't great, but the gold standard is one option. And as you know, exercisers come in all shapes and sizes, all kinds of conditioning, all kinds of joint quality and joint wear and tear. And that one option rarely works even for one person.
Now, one thing that highlights what you're saying, Julie, just beautifully is when we walked through a few episodes back, we were talking about body matching and all the decisions that you made in order to help a client do a push-up, right? If somebody would have seen that on the internet and your title to the video would have been, how to do the perfect push-up, there would have been comments galore, heckling, saying, well, that's not a push-up. That's not a perfect, this and picking this apart and this apart and this apart. But for that client at that moment, that was a perfect push-up, right? It may not have looked like the gold standard. That doesn't matter. What matters is your outcome that you were wanting the client to get was to challenge a certain group of muscles. And this was a way to do it most efficiently and with least amount of risk. And one thing that I think people get caught up a lot when it comes to form is I said the idea, like you're bringing up the gold standard. Well, if I do the gold standard form, that's how I'm going to have the least amount of risk and still be able to get the most benefit from the exercise. And while those intentions are good, that's just not correct. Julie, if you would have had your client do the gold standard push-up, the benefit they would have gotten would have been very minimal because they may not have been able to do one rep of the gold standard push-up, which means the benefit would have been close to zero. The risk would have been incredibly high. Because, again, they may not have had the ability to do it. It may have been too much for their system. And based on their joints and the health of their joints, it may have actually done way more harm than any potential good. And so I think that's what we were trying to get across in this episode is the idea of the gold standard form. Even though it's preached as like, all right, this is how you do a squat and this is how you do a lunge. And we want to be able to progress you from wherever you're at to being able to doing this gold standard. There's always risk involved. There's inherent risk to everything. Yes, there can be potential benefit. But for most people, when they try to do the gold standard version of anything, I'm going to say most people, there's going to be more risk than there is potential reward. And unfortunately, that's not what the mainstream fitness industry tells us. It tells us that, well, you need to fit yourself to this gold standard version of doing the exercise, because if you don't, you're not going to get these benefits and you're going to be a higher risk for hurting yourself. And that's just plain untrue.
Charlie, I think the only place where this gold standard form would apply is if you are competing in weightlifting competitions, because part of competing is that you have to be judged on your doing the movement just like everyone else to make it quote unquote fair. But when we think about exercising for health, there's no competing with other people. There's no competing with what other people look like when they exercise. There's no competing with the weight that people. And in fact, I am very opinionated on this point where you're not even competing with yourself. A lot of times people will be like, well, as long as you're like improving yourself. No, as long as you're being appropriate to where you are right now today. And today I might feel worse than I did yesterday. So what's appropriate today is going to be less than what was yesterday. So I don't want to compete with myself because what was great for yesterday is not what's great for today. But I want to break this down. When I think of the word form, let's jump into Julie's brain. And if everyone thought like me, we wouldn't have this podcast. So don't think like me. Anyways, okay. So when I think of form, I think of what am I wanting to see move when I exercise and what do I want to see not move when I exercise. So think of those two things. And then think about customizing the exercise to what your body needs relative to all the wear and tear, the conditioning, all the parameters that your body has right now. I'm not sure where we took that idea of form of what should be moving and what shouldn't be moving and picked one option of all those things to make it like the gold standard of form. But the best form for you is going to be, what am I going to move? What am I not going to move? So it's like you're applying intention, meaning I'm being specific with what I want to move, what I don't want to move. But then you have to apply the customization of like, where do I need to stop moving, right? Like if you listen to a few episodes back, I walked everyone through how I customized a push-up for a client. So what parts do I want moving? What parts do I not want moving? How much movement there? How much movement until I want them to stop? What's the starting position? And where are they holding the not moving parts? So think about that as your form. And again, that just comes back to our idea of body matching. It's like, how are you going to body match? Because form, again, it doesn't matter what the gold standard form is. What matters is the intention that you're putting into your body matching. That's the right form for you. And just know that your form from session to session to exercise, even in a session, can change.
Hey, Julie, I love that you brought that up. And it's spurring a story in my mind. A few weeks back, I was working with a client and he wanted to go over how he was doing a shoulder press. And when he does them on his own, he has a very specific way that he goes about doing it, but it was kind of bugging his shoulder when he would go about doing it. So we wanted to review and see, okay, like, was he using the correct form? That was kind of the idea, right? And so I asked some questions, okay, what are you using when you do the shoulder press? Like, are you using a machine? Are you using a barbell? Are you using dumbbells? Are you using cables? Are you using bands? And so found out, he's using a barbell, and, there's nothing wrong with using a barbell, but it is a little bit more fixed and it does force people to move in a more specific way and not necessarily allow as much autonomy in the motion based on what's going on with their body. And so he was showing me how he was doing it. And if you videotaped it and put it online, people would say, oh, that is a beautiful shoulder press because it is perfect to the gold standard of the shoulder press. But it was bugging his shoulder. And that is an issue, right? Because that is not only going to, one, it's uncomfortable, but two, that's going to limit his ability to do that exercise or any variation of it long term if he keeps inflaming this shoulder every single time he tries to do a shoulder press. So, okay, that's the big deal, right? So we discussed, well, you know what? What are we really trying to get out of doing the shoulder press? Are we trying to have all the commenters on YouTube tell us how beautiful our shoulder press is? Or are we trying to build the strength, build the health, build the function of our shoulders, of the joints, of the muscles that comprise the shoulders? And I mean, look, if you listen to this podcast, you know very well that it's the latter, right? Like the goal of exercise, the one and only goal of exercise is to build the health and function of your body, not to look cool online. So, I mean, you can look cool online, but it has to be through building the health and function of your body.
Don't worry, you're going to look cool when you exercise like
I look cool online when I work. So anyways, so we say, all right, look, the goal of this is to build the health and function of your shoulders, to strengthen your shoulders and to, strengthen this area of your body, improve the health of your joints. So why don't we do this? Why don't we change how you're doing the exercise? And it was as simple as, instead of having the elbows kind of pinned almost back, so they're in line with his trunk, the elbows came a little bit more forward, which means that, with that, he's not going to be able to use a barbell, but he has access to dumbbells. So he can use dumbbells. He can change the position that he's starting from, and he can move from that position through a slightly different plane, performing a slightly different motion, but getting a more desirable outcome. Yes, it may not look like the gold standard version that you might see one of the caricatures doing online of like, this is how you perform the perfect overhead press, or this is how you perform the perfect military press. Whatever it is, that doesn't matter. What matters is, what are you trying to get from the exercise as far as how are you trying to stimulate your body? And is it a way where the risk of doing that is so incredibly low that you can keep coming back to doing that week after week, decade after decade?
You might be listening to this and be like, wow, all these like tweaks that you're making are kind of subtle. They are, but they're important. And I want to highlight this point that just because a tweak or a change or a customization or a body matching option is subtle, or it might be big, you might be like, wow, that was a big change, versus visually it might be a very small change, makes a huge difference. Because remember, we're here to exercise for life. We're not thinking of 3 months down the road, how strong is my overhead press going to be? We're thinking, how can I get an amazing stimulus now and still be able to challenge and stimulate my shoulder muscles in 40 years? Let me give you just a little example of this. I think it's a little more relatable. So the other day I got new shoes. And when you put new shoes on, you're like, this is so cool. And then there's like that one part where you're like, oh, but that one part feels weird. Like it's rubbing me weird. But it's like, it's going to be fine. It's fine. And then you wear them the first day. And after how many steps do you do during a day? 5,000, 10,000, even 2,000? Once you do 2,000 reps in that one spot that was like, how is it anymore? It's a pretty big deal now. It's like, wow, that part is really annoying. Like,
it's a big
It's a big right? It's like, I can't wait to get these shoes off now, because that tiny little pressure point that was on the side of your big toe that was just okay when you just stood in them turned into a big deal after you did 200 reps of your stepping in them, or 5,000 or 10, however much it was. But this is what we want to do with exercise. If it feels when you're doing it, tweak, move, even if it's the smallest bit, because that smallest bit is going to make it so that you can repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and do it again and do it again and do it again for 40 more years. Because again, we don't want you to just do 2 steps in your shoes. You got to wear your shoes for 10,000 steps a day. We need your shoulders lasting 10,000 steps, not just the 2 steps.
So to us, we say that form doesn't matter. That does not mean that we are being haphazard with the exercises. It does not mean that we are doing things in an unsafe manner, or we are doing exercises in a less effective way. In fact, everything is the exact opposite. It's more strategic, it's more appropriate, and it is highly effective. But what it's not is the gold standard version of the exercise. So we want to give you permission. The next time you go to exercise and you're trying to figure out how you're going to do your lunge, or how you do a squat, or how you do a shoulder press, that you can kind of use the gold standard as maybe a rough starting place of like some idea of how to generally perform an exercise. But from there, it has to be about you. It has to be about, how's my body feeling when I do this? And what, like Julie was saying, slight minor tweaks can I make to start to shift things as like, oh yeah, this is feeling better. And sometimes it's a big tweak that you make. Sometimes it's a giant shift that you make, but you're still able to accomplish the goal of the exercise of stimulating your body, of improving the health and function of your body, of building and rebuilding your body through exercise. And that truly is one of the foundational principles of how you go about not just exercising for the next year or the next 5 years, but decade after decade after decade, exercising for life. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that is so focused on doing the right form when they exercise that they're actually sacrificing their health and function in many ways in order to try to accomplish the gold standard form? Share this episode with them so they can hear our take on it and maybe give themselves some permission to, you know what? I'm not worried about doing the gold standard version anymore. I just need to do the version that's right for me. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find this podcast when they're looking for information on exercise and when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us a 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week. So how'd you like that episode? Did you find the information useful? If you enjoyed what we discussed today, then you are going to love the Exercise for Life Method, which is a book that we just put out and you can get a free copy of by going to exerciseforlifemethod.com. All we ask is that you pay for shipping and handling, so head there now and get your free copy, as well as some exclusive bonuses that you will get instant access to when you get the book. You can learn more and get your copy at exerciseforlifemethod.com. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.